Ladies and gentlemen, what happens when the world's oldest civilization warns you and you don't listen? What happens when the so-called superpowers write off a sleeping giant, only to watch it rise with fire in its eyes? Let me tell you something. India warned the West and they laughed. But the world isn't laughing anymore. The tides are turning. The global South is no longer knocking on the door, begging for a seat at the table. We're building our own damn table. And trust me, it's not just India rising. It's the voices of billions that were silenced, now roaring back. The age of Western dominance is fading, and a new dawn is breaking. For decades, India's warnings were dismissed, its philosophies misinterpreted, its resilience underestimated. The West, wrapped in its illusion of superiority, looked at India and the rest of the global South as chaotic, disorganized, and backward. But let me ask you this, what if the very things they called chaos were actually signs of a deeper, richer culture? What if the so-called mess was the movement of a billion voices, the pulse of a living, breathing civilization that never needed validation from anyone to know its worth? They called it chaos, we called it culture. You see, India didn't need to imitate anyone. While others were building skyscrapers, we were building values. While they drew battle lines in politics and profits, we drew wisdom from centuries-old texts that spoke of peace, balance, and the oneness of all life. While the West pushed consumerism, we spoke of contentment. While they armed themselves with weapons, we armed ourselves with knowledge. That's not weakness, that's vision. And for too long that vision was ignored. They thought tradition meant resistance to progress. They thought spirituality meant ignorance. But what they failed to see was this: India and the wider global South wasn't behind. It was just different. We weren't running their race because we were walking our own path. What the West called inefficiency was actually complexity, managing hundreds of languages, faiths and cultures without losing identity. What they saw as outdated was actually timeless. They didn't understand that in the global South, we weren't obsessed with the new, we were rooted in what lasted. And now, as the West scrambles to solve crises of the soul, climate and character, they're beginning to look toward the very cultures they once dismissed. Yoga, meditation, Ayurveda, ancient Indian sciences that were once called pseudoscience are now billion-dollar industries in the West. From mindfulness apps to spiritual retreats, they're borrowing from the wisdom of the East without giving credit to where it came from. Because deep down, they know the answers they need are in the soil they once called undeveloped. And let's not pretend this dismissal was accidental. It was systematic. Colonialism didn't just steal gold and land, it tried to steal dignity. It tried to convince the world that Europe was the light and the rest were shadows. But that lie is falling apart, and the world is waking up to a new reality. India's time has come, and it's not coming quietly. This isn't about revenge. It's about recognition. It's about correcting the record. It's about saying, we were never broken. You just refuse to understand. Today, India leads in space exploration, digital infrastructure, fintech, and sustainable development. And it's doing it without abandoning its roots. That's not just progress, that's power with purpose. Look around. The global South is no longer asking to be included. It's creating a parallel world order. BRICS is rising. New trade routes are forming. Cultural pride is returning. The narrative is shifting. Because people are tired of being told they need to be modern when they were already majestic. This is more than geopolitics, it's spiritual justice, it's the return of balance, and India, that so-called chaotic land, is leading it. Not with war, not with domination, but with vision. A vision that says every voice matters, a vision that doesn't destroy to conquer, but builds to uplift. So yes, the West called it chaos, but maybe they just didn't know how to read the rhythm of a billion dreams. Maybe they didn't recognize the strength it takes to rise without rage, to grow without hate, to move forward without forgetting where you came from. They saw noise. We knew it was music. They saw disorder. We saw a dance. They saw a crowd. We saw a chorus. And now, that chorus is singing louder than ever. Not for approval, but for truth. India didn't need the world to clap for it. It just needed the silence to end. And now, it has. We were never the problem. We were the solution you ignored. When India spoke, it wasn't with arrogance. It was with ancient wisdom. When the global South raised its voice, it wasn't noise, it was truth that echoed across centuries. But the West, lost in its self-importance, wasn't listening. It had already decided who mattered and who didn't, who leads and who follows, who gets the mic and who stays muted. And in doing so, they dismissed not just countries, they dismissed civilizations. India warned about terrorism before it spread its poison globally. We knew the dangers of radicalization because we lived through it, not in theory, but in blood. We understood the complex layers of ideology and violence because it was at our doorstep. But the warnings fell on deaf ears. When we were fighting extremism in Kashmir, the West called it a regional issue. But when terror reached their shores, suddenly it was a global crisis. Suddenly the war on terror mattered. Suddenly they realized, too late, that India wasn't crying wolf, it was calling out a storm. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and the world came to a grinding halt, it was India that stepped up. Despite limited resources, we sent vaccines to over 100 countries. While rich nations hoarded, India shared. Not because we were desperate for approval, but because that's who we are. We believe in Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The world is one family. But even then, our generosity was patronized. Our science was questioned. Our sacrifice overlooked. The same pattern repeated again and again. Climate change. India and the global south have been bearing the brunt of floods, droughts and rising temperatures for decades. We've been calling for justice, not charity, justice. We said we didn't cause this problem, but we're paying the highest price. And still, the West wanted us to slow down, cut emissions, halt our development, while they kept consuming, polluting, and pretending to be saviors. It was never about saving the planet. It was about saving their comfort. And yet, in every crisis we rose, with grace, with grit, with guts. India didn't wait for a seat at the table. We built our own solutions. Digital public infrastructure that the world now studies. A space program that reached the moon's south pole with a fraction of NASA's budget. A fintech revolution that gave millions access to banking. India wasn't following the West's model. We were innovating our own, quietly, powerfully, unapologetically. But don't mistake patience for weakness, because the global south is tired of being underestimated. We're done with being seen as the problem child. In the global classroom, we have ideas, we have intelligence, we have integrity, and most of all we have the lived experience of suffering and surviving, something the boardrooms of Europe and Washington will never understand from behind their glass walls. The West created the rules of the game, and expected us to play along, even when the game was rigged. But now, the rules are changing. The power balance is shifting. The nations once called developing are now driving growth. The ones labeled unstable are showing the world what resilience really looks like. And as we rise, the narrative changes. Now, suddenly they're listening. Now they want partnerships. Now they realize we were never the problem. We were the overlooked answer. This is not about resentment. It's about reality. It's about setting the record straight. Because we've been dignified in the face of dismissal. We've been generous in the face of greed. But we won't be invisible anymore. You ignored us when we whispered. You silenced us when we spoke. Now you'll hear us when we lead. India didn't need the West's permission to shine. The global South didn't need validation to rise. We're not waiting for applause. We're walking forward, with or without it. Because history won't be written by the loudest anymore. It'll be written by those who endured, who rebuilt, who rose. We were never the problem. We were the overlooked solution. And now the world knows Daju took our resources. Now we take back our power. For centuries they came with flags, ships and guns. They didn't ask. They took gold, spices, diamonds, ideas, labor, stolen from the hands that made them, stripped from the lands that birthed them. They carved up continents, drained economies, and then labeled the survivors as underdeveloped. They built empires on the backs of the global south, and then had the audacity to teach us about civilization. India knows this story better than most. We lived it, colonized not just in territory, but in identity. Our education system was rewritten to glorify the oppressor. Our history was erased or twisted. Our self-worth was buried under layers of foreign rule. But what they could never destroy, no matter how hard they tried, was the fire within, the fire of self-belief. They told us we were too spiritual to be scientific, too diverse to be organized, too poor to matter. But let me tell you something, we were never weak, we were wounded, and there's a difference, because wounds heal, and when they do, they leave behind scars that remind us, never again. You see, power isn't always taken by force, sometimes it's taken by lies, by rewriting history, by building economic systems that trap you. Trade deals that benefit one side, aid packages that come with chains. For decades, the global south was forced to play by rules it didn't write. We were told to open our markets while theirs stayed protected, told to adopt foreign models that didn't fit our people, our culture, our land. And when we failed to thrive in a system designed for us to fail, they called us corrupt, lazy, incapable. But now, something is shifting. That power, the one they thought they owned forever, is slipping. And we are no longer asking for a seat at their table. We're building our own. India is trading in rupees. Africa is uniting its economies. South America is rejecting puppet leadership. The global South is rising, not by mimicking the West, but by reclaiming its authentic voice. Because you can't own what was never yours. Not our culture, not our ideas, not our future. India, once robbed of its wealth, is now one of the world's fastest growing economies. The very country they called the jewel in the crown, now forging its own crown, on its own terms. No more looking westward for approval. No more silence in the face of hypocrisy. We've learned their game, but we've chosen a different one. One rooted in balance, justice, and dignity. And here's the truth. They don't want to admit. They need us now. They need our markets, our labor, our innovation, our data, our diplomacy. But this time the exchange isn't one-sided. This time we know our worth. This time we speak from power, not pleading. And we remember the plantations, the famines engineered by greed, the exploitation dressed up as empire, the suffering wrapped in silence. But we are not bound by that past. We are fueled by it. And this new era, it doesn't belong to those who took. It belongs to those who reclaim, who rise from the ashes, not to destroy, but to rebuild something better, something fair, something true. This isn't about revenge. Revenge is small. This is about justice. This is about restoring a global balance that was violently disrupted. It's about dignity, about pride, about standing tall and saying, we remember what you did, but we will not be defined by it. We are not your former colonies. We are not your charity projects. We are not your second-hand nations. We are equals, and you will treat us as such, because the age of extraction is over. The era of exploitation is done. Now is the time of exchange. Exchange rooted in respect, not dominance. In partnership, not pity. India and the global South are not rising. We've already risen. And this time we bring not just growth, but a new kind of power, one that no one can steal. This isn't East versus West, it's truth versus legacy lies. For far too long, the world was fed a one-sided story, a story where the West was always the hero, the inventor, the liberator, and the East, just the background, just a shadow, just the other. They wrote the textbooks, made the movies, told the tales, and in those tales, the global South was poor, primitive, in need of saving. They painted themselves as the torchbearers of progress, as if knowledge didn't exist until they discovered it, as if history began the moment they showed up. But that illusion is cracking, and behind it is the truth. A truth they tried to bury beneath centuries of domination and denial. Because before there were skyscrapers in New York, there were temples in India that aligned with the stars. Before Newton wrote his laws, Indian mathematicians had already developed the concept of zero. While the West was still debating the shape of the Earth, we were calculating the distance to the moon. Civilization didn't begin in Europe. Progress didn't start with colonization. And freedom didn't come as a gift. We fought for it, bled for it, died for it. But they never told you that. Instead they built a legacy on lies. Lies that said we were always late to the table, that we were always playing catch-up, that everything of value came from the West, that our stories were folklore, while theirs were history, that our resistance was rebellion, while theirs was revolution. But now, we're no longer asking for our history to be acknowledged. We're declaring it, loud, proud, unapologetic, because this isn't about comparing East and West. It's about confronting the truth that colonization wasn't a civilizing mission. It was theft, cultural, economic, human. It left scars on continents and generations, but we've carried those scars, not as symbols of defeat, but as reminders that our survival is victory, our endurance is power, our voice is the proof that the empire never truly won. And India is the heart of that voice. For decades, we were told to copy Western models of government, economy, success, but every time we did, it didn't fit, because we weren't broken, we were just different. And difference isn't a weakness, it's our greatest strength. We don't need to fit their mold, we are the mold breakers. While they built walls, we built bridges. While they chased power, we pursued purpose. Now look around. India is no longer being seen as a follower. It's being looked to as a leader, a nation that can balance tradition with innovation, that can honor its ancestors while launching rockets into space, that can teach the world how to grow fast, and stay grounded. This is not an accident. This is not luck. This is what happens when truth begins to rise, when people stop apologizing for who they are, and start standing in it fully. And the global south is rising right alongside Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, no longer waiting for permission to lead. We are not passive participants in the global story, we are co-authors, and we're writing a new chapter, one where dignity doesn't come from GDP, but from legacy, where power isn't measured in weapons, but in wisdom, where leadership doesn't come from domination, but from truth. So no, this isn't East versus West, that would be too simple. This is a reckoning. This is a mirror held up to the world, a world that has clung to a lie for too long, that progress only looks one way, speaks one language, follows one path. But the future won't be dictated from a single hemisphere anymore. It will be shared. The truth has waited centuries to speak, and now it has found its voice. In India, in the global south, in every nation that was once ignored, erased or underestimated. We don't want your legacy. We want our truth. And now the world will hear it. The world is changing, not slowly, not quietly, but with the force of a long-suppressed storm finally breaking free. And in that storm there's clarity. A new order is forming, not because someone gave permission, but because those who were silenced for centuries have decided to speak, loudly, clearly, without compromise. India is no longer looking for validation. The global south is no longer looking for entry. We are not outsiders trying to get in. We are builders of civilizations, of economies, of culture, of the future. The days of bowing politely while others dictate our destiny are over. We've watched, we've learned, we've endured, and now we act. The myth that power must always flow from west to east is collapsing. The myth that leadership must come with accents and suits and a Western passport is dying, because the world is realizing leadership can come from the soil of Tamil Nadu, from the savannas of Kenya, from the mountains of Bolivia, from the streets of Dhaka. It can come wrapped in a sari, spoken in Hindi, Swahili or Quechua. It doesn't have to look like yesterday, because yesterday is gone. You see, for decades, we were told to be humble, to wait, to be grateful for crumbs, while others feasted on the bread made from our wheat, the gold from our earth, the knowledge from our texts. We were told to catch up, to develop, to modernize, as if we were behind. But behind what? A system built on the extraction of our labor, the erasure of our voices, the rewriting of our truth. No, we're not behind. We were never behind. We were ignored. And now we refuse to be. The West is watching a shift it can no longer deny. The global South is no longer content being the labor force of the world, while others sit in the boardroom. We are becoming the architects of the next era. We're not just participants, we are drivers. And we're not asking anyone to move over. We're moving forward regardless. India is forging alliances, not just with governments, but with people. It's building digital public infrastructure that serves the poor and powerful alike. It's sending satellites into orbit while lifting millions out of poverty. It's teaching the world that modernity doesn't mean abandoning your roots. It means building from them. It means standing tall in who you are, not blending in with who they told you to be. This moment is not about revenge. It's not about returning insult for insult or injustice for injustice. That's not our way. This is about balance, about truth reclaiming its place, about rewriting the story, not to erase the past, but to correct it. Because history wasn't just written by the winners, it was manipulated by the powerful. But now the pen is changing hands, and with it comes the opportunity to tell it all. The pain, the pride, the perseverance. All truth. India will not lead by dominance, but by example. And the global South will not rise by conquest, but by conviction. A conviction rooted in justice, dignity, and unshakable self-belief. We know who we are, we know what we've survived, and we know where we're going. So to the world watching, understand this: we are not the past, we are not the footnotes, we are not the background, we are the future, and we've arrived.